Well, the president is once again putting focus on that Trump Tower meeting, potentially complicating legal matters for his son over the high-level sit-down Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and then campaign chair, who's in his second week of his trial, Paul Manafort, had with a Kremlin-linked lawyer, an alleged former Russian intelligence agency, an oligarch's representative, and an interpreter. So, what's wrong with that? Well, let's take a look at the shifting story from the White House and the campaign. The New York Times first broke the news of the Trump Tower meeting more than a year after it happened. Donald Trump Jr. then released a statement saying, "We primarily discussed a program about the adoption of Russian children." That statement was a lie. We credit journalists who the president calls the enemy of the people with outing that lie told by the president's son, Don Jr., and one we would later find out was dictated by the President of the United States, something the president's lawyer denied.
So he didn't have anything to do with the statement that Don Jr. put out that was being worked on with his team?
Well, no, that was written by Donald Trump Jr. and I'm sure in consultation with his lawyer.
Because the New York Times has reporting that the president okayed the statement.
Well, they're incorrect.
Reports then surfaced that the meeting was actually about information on Hillary Clinton, prompting Don Jr. to release another statement the next day, admitting the meeting was about campaign information. But the lawyer then changed the subject to adoption. And let's remind you, adoption is really about the Magnitsky Act, and that takes you back to sanctions. So it was never about Russian babies. As questions increased about the nature of the meeting, the president's son voluntarily tweeted out screenshots of his emails that made it very clear the offer was on information on Clinton, and the source was part of, quote, the Russian government's support for Mr. Trump. And I want to quickly remind you, last week at a rally in Pennsylvania, the president of the United States told those rally attendees, some children, that Russia did not want him to win. It's bad for Russia. Well, there you have it right there. Not only did Putin 2 weeks ago in Helsinki say he wanted Trump to win, well, right there, Don Jr. said it in an email. The very next week, then White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer gave the administration's position.
There was nothing, that, as far as we know, that would lead anyone to believe that there was anything except for a discussion about adoption of the Magnitsky Act.
He mispronounced it. Nothing except Don Jr.'s emails say it was about information on a political opponent. And then 2 weeks later, with Sarah Huckabee Sanders at the lectern, the White House finally acknowledged the president's involvement in drafting his son's original false statement, otherwise known as a lie.
He certainly didn't dictate, but, you know, he, like I said, he weighed in, offered suggestion like any father would do.
But he did dictate it, making Sanders' statement again a lie. But the president's son repeated this version in his testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee, saying his father may have commented through Hope Hicks. But a letter from the president's lawyers to the special counsel obtained by the New York Times finally confirmed the president did in fact dictate that lie, casting doubt on Donald Trump Jr.'s testimony. Remember, lying to Congress is a crime. And as the administration tried to keep its story straight, the president tweeted this over the weekend. This was a meeting to get information on an opponent, totally legal and done all the time in politics. That would be true if you ignore the fact that this was a hostile foreign government that was trying to attack our elections. And various statements put out by both Donald Trump Jr. and the White House turned out to be lies. Here's what I want to know. Why? If the president of the United States and his campaign did absolutely nothing, why does the president and his son and the president's lawyer continue to change their stories? Jay Sekulow said, over time, the facts developed. Facts do not develop, sir. Facts are facts. Joining me now, Washington Post White House reporter Robert Costa and former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, Mimi Rocco. Okay, Bob, to you first. You are inside the White House more than anybody I know. Donald Trump was on a radio show this morning, a conservative one, that said, oh, this is all the media narrative. Nothing ever changes. Put this in perspective, why it's a big deal. You've got the court of public opinion that doesn't change. But in Robert Mueller's eyes, how is this different? Because Robert Mueller didn't say anything over the weekend. The president did.
Because you have a president weighing in on an active investigation. The president's talking about The meeting with Don Jr. and the Russian lawyers in 2016, as we just discussed, the original response from the administration was that there was nothing to see here. This was about adoptions. The president eventually changed his story, so did Donald Trump Jr. What's so interesting about the timing of the president's tweets in response, in a sense, to the Washington Post story about the ongoing scrutiny of this whole moment back in 2016 is that the president has to make a decision soon. Will he actually sit down with federal prosecutors and talk about that exchange on Air Force One? Will he talk about his knowledge of the meeting with federal investigators in more than a tweet? That's the interview decision laying before him.
Okay, so the president and Don Jr. have changed their story, but the story they're telling now is it was totally legal. We both know it's not legal, but what's the actual punishment? What are the ramifications?
Well, there are several different crimes that could be charged coming out of this set of facts, I think. Obviously, it would need to be facts that the government could prove if they were going to charge it beyond a reasonable doubt. And we have bits and pieces of it. So you have to sort of look at Mueller putting it all together and how does it all, look when you put it all together. But I think the possible crimes are conspiracy to defraud the United States, the same conspiracy that's been charged against the Russians. And it would be conspiring with the Russians to do that by interfering with the sort of fair administration of the election laws. That's one possible serious felony. Another one, as we've been discussing, is possible violation of the obstruction laws. And there's different prongs of that. But basically, it would be interfering with ongoing investigations. At the time that the Trump Tower statement was put out, the false Air Force One statement that we now know was dictated by the president, there were already ongoing FBI and congressional investigations. Now, lying to the public isn't a crime, but I think, if you put it in the broader context, it can be seen as part of a broader effort to mislead investigators. So,
okay, then, Bob, what in the world is the White House strategy here? If clearly it's a violation, and we see the White House change their story over and over, is the game plan here, my wife is about to catch me cheating on her, so why don't I just get out in front and announce it and say it's no big deal?
With this White House, Stephanie, there's the White House, the administration, and then there's President Trump. Based on my conversations with officials and friends of the president in the last few days, it's really the president alone talking with Mayor Giuliani, his lawyer.
But it's not. It's the president, it's Jay Sekulow, and it's Don Jr. And Don Jr. is the one on the hook here. And the president wasn't answering the press, badgering him with questions. He went out there voluntarily. Don Jr. just went on a radio show voluntarily.
And it reflects kind of the isolation of that group. This is not so much about Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Is she going to get questions about it? To be sure, as White House press secretary. But you just nailed it. It's Jay Sekulow, it's Giuliani, it's Don Jr., it's the family and the personal legal team. They're navigating these waters together.
Then what comes of this? Because, yes, if they're speaking among themselves, if they're all out to dinner smoking cigars at Nicola's, they could say this doesn't matter. And to a lot of people in the country, it doesn't. But does it matter to Bob Mueller?
Well, look, Bob Mueller probably knew what Trump tweeted before Trump tweeted it, right? It's all of us saying, wow, look what he just admitted on Twitter, right? He obstructs justice on Twitter, and now he just made a big admission on Twitter. That's pretty stunning. But Mueller already knew what that meeting was about, no doubt. I mean, I think a lot of us had inferred it. Mueller, I'm sure, has facts, right? Evidence, witness testimony, what that's about. So, but yes, it's still a big deal. By Trump saying this, by him saying this is what the meeting was about, it takes away any possible argument or defense they might have had. As crazy as we all might have already thought it was, they can't make that. And prosecutors love to be able to say something's indisputable, which it now is.
Or, Bob, is the president testing the American people? Because it's not Bob Costa that's going to push the president out of office. It's the Republican-run Congress. And if Congress takes a look at the country and they don't seem to mind, if they're not pushing back, if the president again and again lies and changes his story, are the Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryans of the world checking to see how the American people feel about it? And that's what's important to the president? Because if the American people say it's no big deal, he could end up being in the clear, as absurd as that sounds.
It comes back to this point that he just comes up again and again in my reporting, which is that there's a president in the administration. Think about last week. The administration comes out to the White House lectern, talks about Russian interference. On Thursday, hours later, at a rally in Pennsylvania, the president's talking about the Russia hoax. And so you have a president who really is testing the limits of how far can he go in publicly discrediting Robert Mueller and his investigators, knowing there could be a subpoena fight on the horizon, knowing the midterms are just around the corner.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.